Thank you so much. We're going to be moving through some of this content, but as I mentioned, you do have a PDF of the slides. If you have any questions as we move through, please feel free just to drop that into the Q&A. I do want it to be interactive as well as engaging. So we'll be talking about mental wellness for dementia caregivers today, specifically looking at self-care and healing from grief and stress. This presentation today, as I mentioned, is sponsored by Catholic Charities of Hawaii, the Circle of Care for Dementia, and Hale Ku'ike. We are greatly appreciative for them to keep supporting and making these trainings possible. Some of the things that we're going to be reviewing today are just looking at really brief statistics around the impact that dementia has on caregiving, because it is important for us to understand what people's experiences are. We'll talk a little bit about the spectrum around mental wellness and how self-care can really start to contribute to being able to create a little bit more balance for the caregivers. We'll also talk about the role of grief and how it starts to impact who we are, how we heal, and how we get specific support, especially for those who are currently doing caregiving, because I do think there's some certain types of support that are most effective. And then we'll talk about mental health strategies. And so we're going to really be going in depth about things that can be helpful for stress, high levels of anxiety, even after a traumatic event and when we're experiencing grief. And we'll also look at some helpful tools, including applications, community resources, and skills. As with all our Mental Health America flight trainings and any that I give, I typically start with a quote because I love to read and I love sharing wisdom from other people. And this one I thought was so profound. And it basically says, being deeply loved by someone gives you strength, while loving someone deeply gives you courage, by Lao Tzu. And I think that that really speaks to the experience of being a caregiver for a loved one. We'll start with a little bit of a conversation around our statistics. So, specifically here in Hawaii, when we look at people who are 65 and older and they're living with Alzheimer's, that's about 29,000 people. And so, we have to start discussing that experience as part of public health and it being a public health crisis. About 6.7% of people aged 45 and older have a subjective cognitive decline. And so, we can see quite a few of our community members are moving through this process, and quite a few are providing some of that caregiving. 60,000 family caregivers are currently working in Hawaii and getting unpaid, and that's about $1.9 billion in unpaid care. Quite a bit. When we start thinking about the cost just to Medicaid, that's about $240 million. So we have to start thinking about how we're going to talk about caregiving, how we're going to approach that, and to look at it as public health. And that's really what the research says, that we have to start having conversations about improving quality of life for the people most impacted. Because when we don't have those conversations, the caregivers do get impacted. And so we find that here in Hawaii, about 49.6% have chronic health conditions and 16.5 have depression. 8.1% do report that they have poor physical health. So that's why we have to keep having those conversations, because while we did say that there are about 29,000 people per year, and that was out of 2020. The actual projected number is seen to increase by 2025 by about 20.7%, which is quite a bit. And that's going to be about 35,000 people at that point who will be diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So the conversation needs to continue to be put in the front of different legislators, representatives, and public health people. I think that there are a lot of conversations that are being had finally and being shared about the experience of being a caregiver. But sometimes as a caregiver, I think we don't always understand all the different things that are part of that experience. And so this is just a really quick look at all the different ways that caregivers contribute to a loved one. You'll see in the chart that things like household tasks, self-care supervision, and mobility assistance. And I took, because I'm in mental health, I took the emotional and social support piece and made that a little bit bigger so that we could see just in this one domain that part of what we're doing is providing companionship. We're discussing those ongoing life challenges with our care recipient. We're facilitating and participating in all the leisure activities. We're helping that care recipient manage how they feel about what's happening and any family conflicts that might go on, as well as troubleshooting any problems. And that's just one domain. Some of those other domains are absolutely health and medical care, advocacy and care coordination, and then surrogacy that we have to step in and provide some assistance for things like financial or legal matters. All those tasks do fall under what caregivers have to provide. And so keeping that in mind that it isn't always just what some people think of, which is the household tasks and the like supervision and mobility piece, that it's actually quite a bit. And I think that's why researchers have been looking at, and doctors have been wanting to talk more about the fact that caregivers are often considered our invisible second patient. That's the patient who's having an impact from being a caregiver, but not necessarily talking about what's happening. And part of their experience could be these types of things. So maybe they're having a physical symptoms, so pain, fatigue, or sleep issues. Could be emotional responses, feeling irritable or having mood swings. Behavioral changes. They're withdrawing from social support because they feel really overwhelmed, or they're using unhealthy coping skills because these stressors are higher than the coping skills that they have that they practice regularly. Could even be cognitive. So maybe they're having racing thoughts, really having a hard time focusing and paying attention. All these things can be part of someone's experience while they're caregiving, but often not reported enough for the primary care physicians to be able to support any kind of helpful interventions. And so we have to keep having those conversations because when we talk about them, we have to put it in kind of context of mental health because that's my job, right? That when we talk about mental health, it really is kind of the spectrum. So on the left-hand side, you have, I'm healthy, I'm doing well. Any stressors that come to me, I can manage with the skills and self-care that I currently have. And then you move into the yellow, the coping, which means there are some stressors and I'm having to use my self-care and coping skills more, but it still is being managed. It's just a little bit higher levels of stress that I'm experiencing. And then at some point, what's going to happen is that those stressors get so large and overwhelming that the coping skills and the self-care that I'm using are no longer as effective. And now I'm going to start to struggle. And at the end, it's where I'm completely overwhelmed. And the things that I have in my emotional toolbox to be able to help me do not meet my needs in the day to day. And so I'm going to start to feel really unwell. And the great thing about the spectrum is you can move back and forth, which means by learning a little bit more skill, focusing a little bit more on some of those coping skills, you can start to move back into the healthy range. We also have to recognize that some parts of caregiving become very difficult in having to maintain those. And so hopefully when we get to the self-care section, we'll talk about self-care that is doable and maintainable. When I was caregiving, there were a lot of wonderful suggestions, and I was like, I wish I had 2 hours to do that. So I want them to be things that you can do within 5 minutes, or just to have always readily available to you. The things to look for, because I think that's where we have to really focus in, is my best kind of professional awareness, my best kind of expert in me is actually me. And so self-assessment is really important. Looking at common signs of stress for myself, because I'll be the first to notice it, is where we start to do our work. So things like denial and anger, those emotions coming up, just withdrawing socially because it becomes very difficult to manage how we interact with other people, feelings of anxiety and depression, feeling just emotionally fatigued, exhausted. They have a saying in the South where I'm from, which is like feeling bone tired. That definitely can be people's experience even after getting restful sleep. But there, that is that sometimes we just don't get enough sleep. And we'll talk about sleep in just a few minutes because that's a really important conversation to have. And having emotional reactions, those are normal responses even to really stressful situations. And there again, that's lack of concentration and health problems. For some caregivers, they are continuing to work and provide caregiving. And so we have to be aware of the fact that there could be issues around burnout specifically. And again, there's that lower energy. When we talk about it, it's kind of a chronicity, kind of this chronic element of despite doing really good positive things, interactions, self-care, getting that sleep, I still wake up and continue day to day feeling really tired or really hard to get myself motivated. that when I have high levels of stress, one of the things that your body does is it compromises your immune system, trying to save up that energy to deal with a stressor. And so you could find that you more easily get sick and stay sick. It's just part of that stress response the body does. You might find that you have more irritability and less patience because you have less emotional reserves. Again, support systems are so critical to have good outcomes and feeling supported and getting the help that you need. But it does take energy to maintain those relationships. And so you might find yourself moving away, trying to simplify as much as you can, but feeling disconnected from the people around you. And even when you try to do those really great activities like your hobbies, maybe you enjoy reading or gardening, that you just don't find as much fulfillment because you're feeling burnt out at this point and you start to feel unfulfilled. Your personal needs, and that could be things like getting your laundry done, taking that extra shower for the week. That those things just kind of get put on the back burner because you need that time to do other things, and so you start to borrow from tomorrow the things you need for today, and that just starts to pile up. And for people who have extreme stressors, they might have thoughts of hurting themselves or someone else. And if that is something that you're experiencing, to absolutely please reach out for professional help. When we talk about the experiences and all of the ones we just covered as a caregiver, the question becomes like, why aren't we talking about that more? Why aren't we getting more help? And I would say that there is kind of this phenomena that the experience of a caregiver and all the stressors and emotions that come up for them can feel kind of like all the water behind a dam. And that if you were to share just a little bit of what your experience is, it would be like removing your finger from a hole in the dam. And that if I share a little, all the things that are behind that will come rushing out, and then I'll feel drowned in emotion. I'll feel overwhelmed in it, talking about all the things that I'm experiencing as a caregiver. And I think that that is part of why we sometimes don't share how we feel, or we're worried about feeling validated. I'd like to kind of change the idea though. I want you to imagine your stressors like an inflated balloon. And by sharing a little bit, you start to deflate that balloon. It doesn't pop. It just becomes more manageable as we deflate those stressors, we share more about our experiences, and that we can choose how much of that information we let out and with who. So, to try to change a little bit how we feel about that sharing aspect of being a caregiver and who we're going to share it with in healthy ways. This slide is really kind of critical to some of our conversation today, but I don't want it to feel overwhelming because it is a big picture. So let's walk through it together. If you look at that line that flows through the middle, all that is highlighting is the kind of progression as a caregiver that your loved one will go through. So they start kind of maybe preclinical, you get to mild, moderate, and the more of the later stage, severe stages. Now, above that line are these gray boxes, and those gray boxes really just show what happens as a caregiver as you move through that continuum. So in those kind of milder stages, you're going to have things like emotional distress. It's normal to feel that. You might miss days at work. When you move into the moderate level, you'll still have some of those things, but you'll also start to notice that financial or physical strain, possibly even the social isolation. And the things that you did to protect your own personal health, maybe going for that run, taking those vitamins, those start to go down a little bit because you're again taking that time to use for something else. And in our later and late stages, you're going to see a lot more of those kind of financial and physical strains. When you drop to the very bottom, again, it's part of that continuum. And this is where we really want to focus today. What are the changing needs for a caregiver as they move throughout that experience with their loved one? In that mild stage, we really want you to do things that are health promoting. So that keeps those protective barriers in place. We want you to stay connected to your loved ones, your support systems, and do those day to day like diet and exercise. And as you move more into those moderate phases, to start to be intentional, incredibly intentional about what you're doing. And so here, maybe it is trying to find ways to save time, compensatory, that I'm going to try to find ways to problem solve, save time. And if I can't do this, I'll do this. You just start to get really savvy with that care coordination piece. Further down that continuum, it might be helpful to talk to someone, to learn some new skills, and to think about what kind of financial supports are out there for you at those late stages to prepare and to be able to get support, especially when we move into towards the end of life part, to get that grief counseling, get good grief literacy. Um, I never thought I would do a lot of work in grief because it is something that I myself have worked through throughout my lifetime. But as I had my own personal experiences, I found that professionally speaking, we just don't talk about that enough. And yet it's such a natural part of the life cycle and experience. And so we know that just getting that additional support and education can be incredibly helpful because a lot of people aren't talking about it and a lot of people are uncomfortable talking about it. And so we want you to be able to talk and get the support you need, but also just learn about palliative strategies that are options. So that's our big picture of what we're looking at. But let's go down kind of to a smaller picture because while that's a great chart, especially if you're someone a little bit more clinical like me, I don't think we're going to be carrying that information in our brains all day long. And so what I think is more helpful again in that self-assessment piece is something smaller and more manageable. Finding something simple like this caregiver stress assessment is really helpful because it's going to ask simple questions like, are you having a hard time sleeping? Are you having stressful dreams? Are you having a hard time kind of managing your emotions like anger or getting upset? Is it affecting your career, the caregiving that you're providing? This is a really nice smaller picture piece where you can take the assessment and then when you see that, yeah, this is the section that I'm really struggling with, and that can be where you put your self-care focus. So, for example, I noticed that I'm really struggling with those top parts, which is really about sleep quality. Then if I have extra time for self-care or if I'm going to intentionally focus on something, that's where I'm going to put it. And so this is a really nice way to target where you're going to put that extra effort. We keep talking about social support, and that's not accidental. And I say that because I think it's really important to be able to share how we feel, to get validation for what's happening in our lives, but to have a good listener for us. And we don't always have that available in our support system. I have great people in my support system, but they're not always non-judgmental, they're not always available, or they're not always aware of what it's like to be a caregiver, and that can be difficult. So if you're comfortable, feel free to drop into the chat who were some people that you talked to about your experiences and feelings that you feel good about, that you feel validated by, or even what kind of groups have you joined that you found helpful. Excellent. So family, friends, medical providers, absolutely. Um, yeah, oh my gosh, yes. Caregivers at Tutu's house. Thank you for sharing that one. That's fantastic. Coworkers who are trained as social workers. I have a lot of social worker friends. Love them. They have such a great systemic approach and understanding. Family members, church friends, social worker, coworkers. Yes, we love them. Excellent. So I think it's really important to have that idea of who you're going to reach out to, who's a good listener, and to make sure that's a little bit comprehensive. I think when we decide to talk to someone and we only have one person, that sometimes they're not available and that can become difficult. Hospice visitor volunteers, that's awesome. Caregiver support groups, beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. We talk about that support system because it is so critical for people healing. We also want to make sure that you have self-care that's available to you. You heard me talking about sleep, and sleep is one of those things where, yes, we need to get good sleep, but I've been doing a lot more research into sleep for the last year, and what I found was that we don't look at the quality of sleep enough. And one of the things in research that kind of popped up was that Hawaii is number one for the adults who don't get 7 hours of sleep. They get seven or less every single night. So we already start off with being number one in the nation for not getting enough sleep. And so we have to start to look at how do we get better quality sleep. And I think that if you're someone who is struggling to feel rested every day, despite getting a full night, that you should reach out and talk to your primary care physician. If you're someone who isn't just you're not able to get a full 8, that's not going to happen. It's not part of your schedule that you start working with a primary care physician to be able to get quality for however many hours you can get. Other care tips would be spending time in the sun, spending time in nature, and just unplugging from some of the social media pieces, unplugging from being online. I think it's very easy to be engaged in passive pursuits, and I'll be the first person to say, I love playing a game online. I love looking at reels, but sometimes you just lose track of the time that you're spending, and you don't necessarily feel the return for having spent that time. And so when we want you to get that good return, part of what's helpful is that you engage in a skill that you're really good at. And so that's a mastered skill. Maybe you're really fantastic at crocheting. You're really fantastic at woodworking, but you haven't done it in a while. You'd actually get more benefit spending that time doing that activity for 30 minutes than you would doing a passive activity where you're not as much engaged. Aromatherapy is always helpful. I would say if that's something that you're interested in, but you're not well versed in it, to do work with someone who is well trained because certain essential oils are not beneficial to be put into the air. Some can't be used around pets or children, and especially some should not be used if you have certain medical conditions. So while it can be incredibly relaxing, you have a lot of different things that come into play, asthma, allergies. And so you want to make sure that you really select out the things that can be helpful. And it could be something as small as a scented bath product so that when you get that time to take that shower, you just immerse into that nice smell that happens when you use it in the shower. It can be very small. It doesn't have to be comprehensive. I love essential oils. Um, I keep rollers. This is mine for this morning. And I just keep them in a hard case in my bag. And whenever I'm like feeling a little stressed, I just pull it out and use it. And it just that's it. It's that easy and it's within hand's reach once I get that set up. But really think about self-care in terms of being cozy. That's what we want you to think about. That you are having that cozy blanket, relaxing sounds, warm beverages, gentle things that nourish the body, like good meals, so that you can have that recoup. We do want you to be active, and so that could be gentle exercise, but sometimes it's hard to motivate ourselves. And so finding an activity buddy can be really helpful. Like maybe your neighbor down the street likes to go for a walk and you join them every Friday. It keeps you accountable and it keeps you moving forward. We talked about how on the mental wellness spectrum that sometimes we out stress our skills. Kind of. And basically, that means is that coping skills are specific to calming the nervous system. If we get really stressed, the nervous system gets activated. So it's always nice if you have any time to learn a coping skills. Diaphragmatic breathing is fantastic. There's a lot of different ones you can find that only take 5 minutes to be able to do, and it just helps reground you. Something that can also be beneficial is just a bit of distraction to take care of something else that could be a pet, it could be any number of things, but doing things that distract you, or doing things that really help you be more mindful and present. So the opposite side of that. So journaling, having gratitude, and again, sharing those feelings with the people that you care about. I think as you move through the caregiving process, part of what you have to keep asking yourself is like, how do I make meaning out of every new stage that my loved one is in? Because it shifts and changes your relationship with them and your relationship in some ways with yourself and the world. So whatever your belief system is, whatever your support system is, to make sure that it's holding you there and helping you move through it. We're going to talk about radical acceptance and grief in just a few minutes because radical acceptance is one of my favorite skills, but grief literacy, we mentioned how important that can be as well. I think when we talk about mindfulness, you can talk about a lot of different things. And one of the things that's most important is just stay in the moment. It can be really overwhelming to think about all the things that have already happened in the past. And I would say that if it's in the past and it's not painful, then leave it in the past because it's already done, it's unchangeable. But if you think about something in the past that still elicits really strong emotion, it's not quite in the past because it's still affecting you today. So do work on that. We want to plan for the future because, that helps us get to where we want to be, but the future is often very uncontrollable. We have to have flexible planning. Where we do the most work is in the moment right now. So if I have 5 minutes right now to do some type of self-care, that's all I'm going to focus on. I'm not going to focus on, I can't find that 5 minutes tomorrow, or I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this on Saturday. Just the moment right now. And we're going to talk about radical acceptance in just a minute. But the other types of mindfulness that can be helpful is just doing a meditation. It doesn't have to come out of a spiritual practice. It can literally just be walking meditation. What do I see? What do I hear? How does the weather feel? And just not being distracted and enjoying the moment. I definitely enjoyed having a cup of tea on the porch during my caregiving process just to deep breathe and unwind. Even if I only had 10 minutes, it was just enough to hear birdsong and just to watch the wind in the trees to remind myself like this is where I'm at and I just need to kind of focus on taking care of myself. We can become really overwhelmed and stressed when we multitask too much. And I'll be the first to say, as a caregiver, you're going to multitask. That's just part of the nature of what happens. But when you have the moment to not multitask, if you have that 15 minutes to have a sandwich, then unplug, unwind, and just eat the sandwich. Just stay in the moment because that multitasking continues to feed into our stress and can be really hard when you have to lay down at night to unwind all those things that we put all of our attention and focus on. When we're talking to someone, again, we want to multitask. We want to think about the lists and all the things we have to do, but if possible, to try to stay really good and engaged, be accessible, respond to those conversations, and to think about just the moment ahead of you so that you can be a good listener. Radical acceptance. We often hear people say, like, it is what it is. And while that can be good radical acceptance, it's not when it sounds like it is what it is, right? That's very flippant and dismissive. Radical acceptance is about when I look at a situation, I look at it and say, what part belongs to me? What can I change that is in my capacity to change? So that's where I'm going to put my time and energy. Everything that is uncontrollable, I'm not going to put time and energy there and trying to change it because it's not going to. So I always love Heart and Brain, this little cartoon that you find here. And I thought it's a great example of what radical acceptance is not. So Heart says, things are going great, looking at this beautiful scene. And then Brain says, Heart, turn around. And then he's like, nope. Oh, he's in a bit of denial. And what radical acceptance says is that we actually want to accept reality, to move away from this idea that it isn't fair, it shouldn't be this way, because whether or not it should or shouldn't doesn't change the fact that it is. And so there you see that radical acceptance again. This is what it is. I don't have to like it. I don't have to agree with it. I just have to say I'm not going to waste time and energy fighting it when it's unchangeable. And it does require daily practice. That's why we like to say it's a practice of radical acceptance. When we are in a painful situation, denial feels good because it means we don't have to look at it. But again, denial can be part of the grief process. But if we stay in it for too long, we're just waiting. We're waiting for that rest of it to catch up with us, that reality. It can also be radical acceptance, an alternative to forgiveness. And I think that doing a lot of work with people who have come out of trauma, that sometimes they get the feedback of like, you need to forgive them. It needs to be forgiven. And I actually say, like, it just needs to be looked at and said, like, this happened. Now, what do I need? Kind of that simple. And I say simple, but again, it's a daily practice. With those tips, with those things we just discussed, what are some of your favorite self-care things that you like to use that you found to be really effective? And, whether that's 5 minutes or 50 minutes, if you're open to it and you have some ideas, please feel free to share. I always read through people's recommendations and sometimes borrow them for the weekend, like, oh, I love that idea. I will also do that idea. I see some people talking about listening to peaceful music, doing Qigong or Tai Chi, massage or my therapy and fitness. Oh, hiking in the forest. Yes, I'm looking forward to getting back to that. Spending time with family, yeah, absolutely. Reading and journaling, swimming, walking on the beach, going to exercise, music and tapping. Yeah, absolutely. I love it. Walking with my dog and smooth jazz. Fantastic. That deep breathing again. Yes. People often don't do the deep breathing because they think like it's so simple. How can it be effective? When actually the research shows over oxygenating that system really helps get it started into doing the decrease of the nervous system response. Taking a shower, yes, with those body washes smells heavenly. Absolutely. Exercise, listening, prayer, meditation. Wandering through Barnes and Nobles and grabbing a latte as I leave. That's a dangerous outing for me, Lorraine, but I love it. Dancing around the house while blasting worship music. Absolutely. And going outside my garden. I'm an avid gardener. I didn't say I was a good gardener, but I am an avid gardener and I love to try. Fantastic. So there's so many different kinds of self-care that can be beneficial. And the one that I'd kind of like to talk to you about for just a few minutes is gratitude. And so sometimes we like to say, I have an attitude problem and my attitude problem is gratitude. I think that we sometimes have that conversation and we say, what am I grateful for today? And that's an easy gratitude practice. Like, what are the two things I feel grateful for? What relationship do I have that I feel grateful for? But I would say that the most challenging gratitude practice that for me is really helpful is to ask that third question, which is to say, what challenging part of my life am I grateful for? Because it taught me about myself. So finding gratitude in challenge really helped me through my own caregiving experience. And this is my actual personal gratitude kind of statement from going through that process was, I am grateful for my grief because it reminds me I have been loved and have loved. So looking at the challenging and hard parts and finding that kind of hidden blessing inside of it can be really helpful. Our community has been through quite a lot of different things, and so we really want to honor having a conversation about grief because grief is part of loving someone, being part of being a caregiver as they move towards that end of life part. And it can be a number of different things as well. Grief at its core is loss of something and loss of someone. And it could be something like the expectation of what you thought 2023 would look like. I've heard so many people say, I will not have 2024 look like that because they did have an expectation of what that year was going to be like. And so they can't have grief over the loss of an expectation, the loss of a family home, a pet, and yes, a loved one, or even how well a loved one was doing at a specific time as they move along that spectrum. If you have a history of trauma, even if that trauma is completely different to what you're going through now, if the emotions are similar, you will find that it could also pull up at the same time. And so do talk to someone if you find that happening for yourself. As you know, when these stressful things happen, when these changes occur, you have what you have. And that means if I didn't have a self-care practice in place, if I didn't know coping skills, that's exactly what I had to kind of work with in my toolbox to address the anxieties or the grief. And so anytime that I have extra time to be able to get more, I will absolutely do that. And I'll be the first person to say, if you had talked to me 10, 20 years ago, I would not be as big of a self-care advocate as I am now. But I found myself in situations where my toolbox looked very empty compared to the thing that was in front of me. And I had to go, I need more skills. And I think that's what brought me to being able to talk to this wonderful group of people and learn more about this kind of caregiving is because I had my own experience and I was like, I needed more tools as well. So part of grief is just to understand that we cope differently with those situations. We grieve very differently from each other in those situations. And we have to honor the process for each person. Not everyone wants to talk about it in that moment. Not everyone's going to cry about that process. And some will say, I need that release. And other people will say that doesn't make me feel better. And so you can see that even within a strong family support system, there will be so many differences that can be quite difficult to get your needs met when someone else is in a very different place. And I think that's why it's important to talk about grief because nothing is either good or bad. It's about what are the needs and who can fulfill those. And that's why we start to think about possibly joining a group or getting that professional help because it pulls you outside of the system that is so impacted. When you're giving that caregiving to a loved one, sometimes what happens is as you move through that spectrum of care, you do go through a grief process of how they change and how your relationship changes as it's related to that person. But you don't always have time to look at that. You don't always have time to look at those difficult moments because you're still caregiving. And you put that on a shelf and you say, I'm going to look at that later. And then you become very surprised when 6 months after a passing or 6 years after that those emotions come flooding back in and you say, why now? And I would say it's probably because you're in a more balanced place with a lot more support that your body inherently wants to heal and says, we can look at all this now. So putting it on a shelf actually often just delays having that experience. And there's nothing good or bad about when different elements of grief come. But as someone who works in a clinical setting, as someone who has kind of that background, I do think that we do you a disservice by kind of saying, hey, it's about a year, because it's not really true. What we're looking at is how well are you functioning in the day to day at the end of the year as to whether or not professional support would make a little bit more sense at the end of that. But I'd say the process of grieving someone, missing someone, loving someone is a lifetime experience. And it does come and go like the waves, where year one might be difficult and year five might be really difficult. And you don't see the connection, but it happens. So just understand that it's very normal to love someone and miss someone, and that there's no timeline on that. When we talk about grief, you'll hear a lot of different names kind of moved through, and Kubler-Ross is one of those. And I'll be the first to say this is not a model that's very evidence-backed. It's a little bit more conversational. And the conversational part is just to say these could be things you experience. You might experience when you're grieving denial, like not me, not here, not now, anger or anxiety because you feel a loss of control or hopelessness, bargaining. If I do this little bit more, will this happen in return? Depression, feeling sad, or acceptance, that radical acceptance, the new. Or you might not have any of these, or you might go back and forth between them. Everyone's experience is very different. The model that I kind of hold a little bit closer to myself is this course of grief. And the reason I like it is I think that it makes a lot of sense and it can allow for cultural practices. It can allow for a lot of differences to come into play into how this looks. So the course of grief would say that at the initial loss of something or someone, that I'd feel numb. And then I start to miss them. I pine for them. And that disorganizes my life and causes despair. And I find some type of meaning, some type of healing, and then I start to reorganize. And what that looks like for you will be very different and very unique, but it gives a nice outline for the process of what it looks like. And it, for me, validates it without stigmatizing the fact that it's very disorganizing and chaotic. There's a lot of despair and loss, but we reorganize and we find meaning. As we talk through all the different things that are part of the experience for the caregiver, I think the big highlight here is how do we get support? Because it's very much needed. And there's different types of support. So I had people saying, oh, what can I do? What can I do? And the idea of coming up with a list felt really stressful just in general, like, okay, let me try to find time to figure out a list. So different types of help and support could be instrumental, something specific. On a Tuesday, can you pick up the medication every single Tuesday? On Thursday, can you just bring dinner and leave it for us? Like something that is definable, doable, and accessible that helps in the situation. It could just be emotional support that that's the person I can reach out and talk to. Informational. We all mentioned our beautiful social worker friends, our professional friends, that they are people who are well versed, well informed, who can provide us with some of the information that we need. But the one that's most stressful is kind of the unwelcome support, the advice, the judgments, or the things that just create more work for us, that it's better to offer something that is helpful for us than to offer things and give us things that just make us manage more things. And it's okay to have those conversations. When we are moving towards those later stages of caregiving, when we are post care, we get impacted in really specific ways. And I think one of the things that we have to start preparing for is our social health and how we start to, because let's be honest, as we move towards later stages, it takes more time, it takes more energy. And so, yes, relationships can start to kind of move away, get a little bit more distant because we need to spend more time with our loved one. So, here's a good time to get that emotional support, to pre-plan in doing a little bit more with those support groups, getting that professional support because in post-care, you'll find that your schedule opens up in a way that's not always comforting because you spent so much time and energy with your loved one that when that schedule opens up, it feels in some ways really like empty. And so being able to have that kind of pre-planned and in place is really helpful. Learning about that good grief literacy, about personal growth and that gratitude that we talked about, even that kind of grief mantra can be helpful no matter what you believe, no matter what your faith system is or isn't. And I've worked with people who were atheistic to pagan. And I would always say this. However, you make meaning into what is difficult in your life is what's important, as long as it helps you heal. So engage in rituals or beliefs or activities that just bring more meaning to your life. And think about how you're going to honor your loved one. The relationship in terms of the physicality has changed and is transitioning, but the relationship in terms of the emotionality, the love, and the care, it hasn't. And so just making new rituals and new places for them to belong in your life is really important. Also, having time to think about your experience as a caregiver. When that schedule opens up, some people will find like that need to give back. And so maybe just staying active in your community and active doing charity work can also be of benefit. We know as a caregiver that there's a lot of impact that happens to us, but there's actually a lot of gains as well that post caregiving, you will be able to look back and reflect on how much togetherness that you had, how many activities that you did together. You'll feel that nice reciprocal bond of loving them and them loving you back. You'll find a lot of spiritual and personal growth. I sometimes said at the end of my caregiving experience, like, I don't question who I am or what I can do because at this point I know that this is where I'm at and this is what I can do. And I was like, sticker. Like I felt good about my experience no matter how difficult it was because I learned a lot and it can increase faith and belief for some people. And again, there's those feelings of accomplishments and mastery, doing things you never thought you would have to do and learning how to doing them well so that your loved one has that sense of peace. We know that about 55 to 90%, that is incredibly high. 90% of the dementia caregivers say that they had positive experiences, and that's really important to embrace. Some of those top interventions that we look for to support our caregivers is going to be the evidence-based interventions like resources for enhancing Alzheimer's caregiver health, so REACH, individual therapy, peer support groups, and just activities, physical and leisure activities that really bring back that positive emotion for yourself. We do have our REACH program and it provides a lot of wonderful things. It's 4 sessions and trainings and it's free. And if you want to get connected with that to reach out, that information is there and it is in the PDF of your slides. There's a lot of really fantastic apps. So we have Dementia Emergency, that's for caregivers and learning to communicate when there's a crisis. The Dementia Talk app, that's behavioral tracker, medication lists. COVID Coach is one that's great for free mindfulness. And then CBTI, track that sleep, get those recommendations. You'll also find MindMate, which is Created and founded by former caregivers, and it has a lot of great mental exercises. Our Gray Matters is basically like a portable scrapbook app, and it has a lot of different experiences of people like sharing. And then you have your mindfulness. There's a nice little cluster of mindfulness. So Calm, Aura, Headspace, Insight Timer, and then that one on the far right is Breathe. So just putting it on there and relaxing. And some of these do have a lot of free exercises. I believe Insight Timer is the one where you can get some really nice free mindfulness exercises. And then Prescription Saver, saving money on some of those needed prescriptions. We talked about the importance of resources, and there are quite a few out there. But if you're looking for professional help, we highly recommend contacting Catholic Charities, the Hawaii Psychological Association, or Psychology Today. When people call me and just say, hey, I need someone to talk to, I often refer them to Psychology Today because you can put in the type of insurance, the type of provider, and the specialty that you're looking for, and it will filter out. And most psychologists update Psychology Today more than any other app. Even their websites. I don't know why it's a thing, but these are great places to find that professional help. Other resources they mentioned earlier about that library of trainings with so many fantastic webinars. And I have sat through a couple of them and learned so much about just really day-to-day tips on how to support being a caregiver or a loved one with dementia. So that's that first one to go to and look at some of those trainings. We have the Alzheimer's Association, the Alzheimer's.gov page, the National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center, and the National Institute on Aging, Department of Health and Human Services. If you're wanting to get involved with a few more of those groups and education sessions, the Hawaii chapter for the Alzheimer's Association is a wonderful place to go, and this is their information. Feel free to call them and get connected. If you have any concerns about mental health, specifically crisis planning, our noshame.gethelp.org page is a wonderful place to go. We have 988 active now in the state, and so that's your mental health crisis number. If you have an 808 phone number, it will route directly to Hawaii Cares. But if you have an out-of-state area code, you'll need to tell them, I'm in Hawaii. But if you want to skip that 988 portion because you do have out-of-state, you can call Hawaii Cares directly. And this is a great place to do some of that crisis planning. We'll make sure that you have this, and there's that 988 again on Hawaii Cares, but we also have that text line. We have LGBTQ support for Trevor Helpline and free online screens if you're curious about it. It's anonymous and it can go over things like sleep, anxiety, or depression, and that's through us here at Mental Health America of Hawaii. Of course, we talked about our COVID coach. And if you want to learn a little bit of those coping skills that I mentioned, you'll see we have quite a bit of social media, but at the very bottom, there's YouTube at MHA of Hawaii. That is a great place to go if you happen to find yourself there and you click on the Munch and Learn series. That is mini training sessions that teach you coping skills, and each training is about 15 minutes or less, so very doable, but that's where you can learn how to do things like diaphragmatic breathing, autogenic training, progressive muscle relaxation, short, easy kind of nervous system calming pieces that can be beneficial. Um, there's also a bit.ly link to our screeners, but you can also call us if you need any support. We have our Oahu office number there and our Maui County office. The QR code is to our survey, so if you have time and want to give us any feedback or have things you would like to see that we haven't mentioned, please feel free to access that. But I know it was a lot of information. I want to save time for questions and answers, but thank you so much for joining us today for learning a little bit more about self-care.